Kansas, 1944. The prairie wind carried more than dust that year. It carried disbelief. When the trains arrived and German women stepped onto American soil, even the locals could not understand why their enemies were being fed, clothed, and sheltered. And yet, behind the barbed wire and watchtowers, something quietly radical began to happen. In kitchens once used for church gatherings and school suppers, the women who had once served Hitler were now learning to bake bread beside the very people they had been taught to hate. The train screeched to a halt beneath a sky the color of ash. Helga Mueller pressed her palm to the window, staring out at the endless wheat fields of Kansas. The land seemed unreal, flat, golden, and open in every direction, so different from the bombed-out streets of Bremen. A whistle blew. Guards shouted in English. The door slid open, and the cold prairie wind rushed in, carrying the scent of soil and smoke. Helga stepped down carefully, boots sinking into the dust, her wrists aching from the long journey. Around her, dozens of German women shuffled forward in silence, eyes down, their uniforms faded to the color of dishwater. They had imagined American camps as cages of cruelty, places where vengeance would be served cold. Instead, they found whitewashed fences, wooden barracks that smelled faintly of pine, and guards who spoke softly, almost apologetically. One young soldier offered them canteens of water. Another pointed toward the dining hall, where steam rose from the roof like a signal of warmth. Helga hesitated. Was it a trick? She had seen kindness used as bait before, but hunger silenced her doubt. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet murmurs and the clatter of metal trays. Potatoes, bread, beans. It was more food than she had seen in months. A woman beside her, Elsa, whispered, "They eat like kings." Helga forced a smile, but her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. The food was simple, yet each bite felt like betrayal to the hunger she'd left behind, to the ruins of her home, to the idea of what an enemy was supposed to deserve. Later that night, as the camp settled under a silver moon, Helga sat on her bunk, listening to the rustle of the prairie grass outside. The guard's footsteps faded, leaving only the sound of wind through wire. She thought of her mother's kitchen in Bremen, the smell of dough, the warmth of the oven, and felt something stir inside her that war had long buried, the memory of softness. She did not know it yet, but Kansas would teach her more about strength and survival than any battlefield ever could. It would teach her that even in captivity, dignity could be rebuilt one loaf at a time. The mornings in Camp Concordia began with the clang of the mess bell, echoing across the frozen Kansas plain. Frost glazed the barbed wire, turning the fence into something almost beautiful under the weak November Sunday. Helga Müller rose from her cot, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. The barracks were quiet except for the shuffling of boots on wood and the soft murmurs of women trying to keep their spirits from collapsing under the weight of routine. When the guards opened the doors, the prairie greeted them wide and pale, the horizon stretching forever. It was nothing like the dark forests of Germany. Here, there were no air raid sirens, no smoke columns, no rubble, only silence so vast it frightened her. The guards were young, barely older than she was, their accents thick and rural. One of them, Private Jenkins, had a way of tipping his hat awkwardly whenever he passed. It was as if he did not know whether to fear her or pity her. The camp itself was a contradiction. The fences spoke of captivity, but the world beyond seemed open enough to touch. Inside, the women organized themselves with military precision beds, made tight, floors swept, chores divided. It was the only way to keep from unraveling. But despite the order, loneliness lingered like dust in every corner. One morning, Helga was assigned to laundry duty. She stood beside the outdoor wash bins, her fingers stiff and red from icy water, scrubbing uniforms until her knuckles bled. Yet even here, something unexpected happened. A group of American women from town appeared at the gate with baskets of linens. They spoke kindly, offering soap and extra cloth. Helga avoided their eyes, ashamed of the patch on her sleeve that marked her as a prisoner. But one of them, a middle-aged woman with hair pinned neatly beneath a scarf, smiled. "We're short on help," she said to the guard. "If any of them can sew, we could use hands at the church." The guard hesitated, then glanced at Helga's needle-stiffened fingers. "She can." The woman nodded approvingly. "Tomorrow, then." That night Helga lay awake, listening to the coyotes cry beyond the fence. She thought about that American woman's voice, firm, gentle, unafraid. It was not the tone of an enemy. For the first time since capture, Helga wondered if there was life beyond the wire that did not see her as a monster. Perhaps there were people who cared more about mending fabric than measuring loyalty. As the moonlight crawled across the barracks floor, she whispered to herself in German, "Vielleicht gibt es Güte überall." Perhaps there is goodness everywhere. The words felt dangerous to believe, yet comforting to say. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she dreamed not of bombs, but of bread, warm, sweet, and rising. The sound of the camp gate opening came with a new rhythm that morning, different from the usual orders and roll calls. Helga Müller stood with her hands clasped as the guard read off names, hers among them. A transport truck waited near the fence, its flatbed dusted with hay. They were to work outside the camp, he said, helping farmers harvest before the winter froze the soil. The words struck the women with disbelief. Outside the fence, it felt like being told they could breathe again. They climbed into the truck, faces hidden beneath scarves to block the prairie wind. The drive carried them past miles of wheat fields, their golden waves broken by the occasional barn or scarecrow. Helga's stomach tightened with every passing mile. Freedom was so close she could almost smell it. Yet the armed guards riding beside them reminded her that the world beyond was still forbidden. When they arrived at the farm, a tall man in denim overalls approached, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes were hard but not cruel. "They'll help with the threshing," he said to the guard, then to the women, more softly, "Just don't break the machines." The work began in silence. The women moved like ghosts between the rows, cutting, stacking, binding. The wheat dust clung to their hair and made their throats burn, but there was something pure about the labor. It was honest, clean, and utterly human. By noon, Helga's arms ached, yet she felt a strange satisfaction each time a bundle of wheat fell perfectly tied in her hands. The farmer's wife, a sturdy woman with sun-browned skin, brought them water and cornbread. The prisoners hesitated, unsure if it was allowed. The woman only said, "Eat, you've earned it." Helga took a bite. The bread was coarse, sweet with molasses, unlike anything she had known in Germany. For a moment she forgot the uniform on her back. That afternoon, as they loaded the last bundles into the wagon, a little boy peeked from behind the barn. His hair was the color of straw, his cheeks streaked with dirt. Helga smiled cautiously. He didn't run. He just stared, curious, and offered her a small apple. She accepted it with trembling hands. It was not the taste of fruit that moved her, but the simple act of being seen as human again. On the ride back to the camp, the women were quiet. The setting sun painted the prairie gold, and Helga felt the wind whip through her hair like a memory of freedom. Somewhere, deep inside her, something long dormant began to stir, not defiance, not hope, but a quiet pride. She had labored as a prisoner, yet earned respect through her work. For the first time since captivity, Helga realized that dignity could survive even behind wire, if one remembered how to build, how to create, and how to give back to the world that had once taken everything. The Kansas wind carried the scent of wheat and wood smoke the morning the guards summoned Helga and 3 other women to the office. She feared punishment at first. Perhaps someone had complained, or perhaps their quiet moments at the farm had been misinterpreted as disobedience. But instead of discipline, the commandant held a letter in his hand from the Concordia Methodist Church. It was an invitation. The local women's committee was hosting a Thanksgiving baking drive and needed extra hands to prepare loaves and pies for soldiers stationed nearby. The guards wanted volunteers. The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. None of them knew what to expect, an act of charity or a test of loyalty. Helga raised her hand anyway. She remembered the farmer's wife, who had handed her cornbread without hesitation. Perhaps this would be another small crack in the wall between enemies. The next day they were escorted to town in a truck that smelled of hay and engine grease. The streets were quiet, lined with oak trees shedding their last leaves. Children pointed and whispered as they passed, their mothers tugging them back with cautious glances. When they arrived at the church hall, Helga's breath caught. Inside were long wooden tables covered in sacks of flour, tins of sugar, and stacks of gleaming pie plates. The smell of cinnamon and butter floated in the air like a memory of peace. An older woman with kind eyes and silver hair introduced herself as Mary Thompson. "You'll be helping us with the baking," she said gently. "No uniforms here, just aprons." The guards stayed near the door but did not interfere. Mary handed each woman a clean white apron, freshly pressed. When Helga tied hers around her waist, it felt like shedding part of her captivity. For the next hours, they worked side by side with the Americans. At first there was silence, an invisible wall of caution and unspoken judgment. But as dough needed kneading and flour clouded the air, small things began to break the tension. One woman hummed a hymn, another accidentally dropped a rolling pin, and everyone laughed. Helga's hands moved with precision born of habit. Her mother had once taught her how to fold yeast dough gently so that it breathed. Mary watched her work, then asked softly, "You've done this before?" Helga nodded. "My mother baked every Sunday, before the war." Something shifted in Mary's eyes, a mix of recognition and sorrow. When the first pies emerged from the oven, golden and steaming, the women stood together, faces glowing from heat and effort. For a moment, there were no sides, no uniforms, no nations, only women who understood what it meant to make something warm in a cold world. As Helga wiped flour from her cheek, she felt it clearly for the first time since capture. This was not mercy, this was dignity shared, and perhaps that was what true freedom really tasted like. The next morning, the church kitchen came alive before sunrise. Steam fogged the windows, and the scent of warm butter filled the air long before the bell tower rang. Helga stood beside Mary Thompson, sleeves rolled up, watching as sacks of flour were emptied across the table like small snowdrifts. The other American women worked in pairs, laughing easily, measuring nothing, tossing pinches of salt and dabs of sugar by instinct. Helga's movements were careful and exact, her dough weighed, her lines straight, her posture almost military. It was the only way she knew how to keep order in a world that had fallen apart. But her precision drew quiet glances from the others. One whispered behind her, "They even bake like soldiers." Another added, "Can they follow a recipe without orders?" The words burned, but Helga said nothing. She had learned that silence was its own kind of armor. Instead, she focused on her task, kneading the dough in slow, steady circles until the air filled with the faint rhythm of resistance. Mary approached from behind, her eyes curious rather than judgmental. "You've got strong hands," she said gently. "What did you do back home?" Helga hesitated. "I studied nursing," she replied. "Before the war, before everything." Mary nodded, pressing her own palms into the dough beside her. "Then you already know how to heal things, just in a different way." The comment caught Helga off guard. She blinked, unsure whether to feel comforted or exposed. By midday, the tables were lined with unbaked loaves and half-filled pie crusts. The Americans worked quickly, chatting about their husbands overseas, their gardens, their children's schooling. Helga listened but did not speak. When one of the women asked if she had family in Germany, her throat tightened. "A mother," she said quietly, "and a brother. I don't know if they're still alive." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Mary handed her a small tin of cinnamon. "We're making apple pies next," she said softly. "Would you like to help?" Helga nodded, grateful for the distraction. She sliced apples thin as paper, her fingers moving with the precision of memory. Each motion carried her back to her mother's kitchen, the scent of yeast and smoke, the sound of laughter before it all went dark. When the first pies went into the oven, the smell filled the room with something wordless. Even the Americans stopped talking. As the heat rose, so did the unspoken understanding that enemies could share more than hatred. They could share hunger, labor, and the fragile art of creation. When Helga finally pulled her pie from the oven, the crust perfectly golden, Mary smiled and said, "Beautiful work." Helga looked down at her hands, dusted with flour, trembling slightly. For the first time in years, they were not hands that destroyed or obeyed. They were hands that made something whole. By the third morning, Helga moved through the church kitchen as if she had always belonged there. The rhythm of baking had replaced the rhythm of marching. She rose with the dawn, tied her apron in a neat knot, and joined the chorus of voices already humming beneath the crackle of the oven. Yet what struck her most was not the work itself. It was the way the American women seemed to move without fear of imperfection. They laughed when flour spilled, sang when they forgot the sugar, and spoke to one another with a kind of ease that Helga had never known. In Germany, precision had been pride, Mistakes were punishable. Here, mistakes were shrugged off, brushed aside like loose crumbs. Helga found herself studying them, their gestures, their warmth. When one woman accidentally burned a batch of biscuits, she simply waved her hand and said, "Well, the chickens will be grateful." And everyone burst into laughter. Helga could not understand how something so small could feel so powerful. Mary noticed her watching and smiled. "You don't have to be perfect, dear," she said. "Bread rises best when you don't fight it." Helga blinked, unsure how to answer. All her life, she had been taught that worth came from obedience, not ease. Yet in this kitchen, it seemed that worth came from something gentler, something freer. When she rolled out her dough again, she tried it Mary's way. No ruler, no lines, just touch and instinct. The dough softened beneath her fingers, pliant and alive. For the first time, she felt as if she was shaping something that also shaped her in return. Later, as the pies cooled on the windowsill, the women shared their stories over cups of weak coffee. They spoke of rationing, of husbands gone to war, of nights spent praying for sons who never returned. Helga listened, realizing that grief sounded the same in any language. When it was her turn, she spoke of Bremen, of the bakery near the harbor where her mother once worked, of the bomb that took it all away. No one interrupted. No one judged. Instead, Mary reached across the table and covered her hand with her own. The gesture was simple, but it carried more mercy than Helga had ever felt in her life. That afternoon, as they prepared one last batch of bread, Helga caught her reflection in the oven's metal door. She looked older, but lighter. The war had taken so much from her faith, country, certainty, but here, among these women, she discovered something the war could not touch. Strength did not always wear a uniform or speak in commands. Sometimes it wore an apron, smelled of cinnamon, and knew how to forgive. And as the oven's warm glow touched her face, Helga realized that in learning to bake again, she was also learning how to live. By the end of the week, the women no longer needed words to communicate. The language of the kitchen had become their common tongue, the rustle of aprons, the soft thud of kneading, the hiss of loaves rising in the oven. Helga moved beside Mary like a shadow, quick to anticipate what she needed before she asked. The church kitchen, once a place of suspicion, had turned into a fragile bridge between two worlds. Every morning they exchanged small gestures that held more weight than diplomacy ever could, a shared bowl, a smile over steam, a nod that said you belong here, even for today. One afternoon, Mary brought from her satchel a worn recipe book tied with string. The pages were yellowed and soft, filled with scribbled notes in fading ink. "My mother's," she said simply. "I thought you might like to see how we do things here." Helga traced the lines of handwriting as if it were scripture. Beside the English words she didn't fully understand, Mary had drawn tiny sketches of pies and cakes, each more delicate than the last. Helga pulled from her apron pocket a folded scrap of paper she had kept hidden since Bremen, a single recipe written by her mother for apfelstrudel, smudged with flour and nearly torn through the middle. She laid it on the table beside Mary's book. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mary smiled softly. "Let's make both," she said. What followed was a quiet truce of flour and memory. Helga showed Mary how to roll the dough thin enough to see through, how to dust it lightly so it wouldn't tear. Mary, in turn, taught Helga how to crimp a pie crust edge just so, to make it pretty without wasting a thing. When the two desserts baked side by side, the air filled with the mingling of cinnamon and apple, sweet and sharp, a scent that seemed to erase borders. The guards outside chatted idly, unaware that peace was being practiced inside, one pie at a time. When the oven bell chimed, the women gathered around, their faces flushed from heat and joy. Mary cut a slice of strudel and offered it to the others. One of the American women tasted it and laughed softly. "It's too good to be the enemy's," she said, but her tone carried no malice. Helga smiled shyly. "It's my mother's," she replied, her voice trembling. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was a silence of respect, not tension. As the day faded into amber light, Mary handed Helga a new sheet of paper and wrote down her pie recipe beside Helga's strudel. "A fair trade," she said. Helga nodded, clutching the paper like a passport to something sacred. In that simple exchange of sweetness, the war shrank. And for the first time, Helga believed that peace could be baked one shared secret at a time. The kitchen had become their refuge from the noise of war. Each morning, the guards unlocked the doors, and Helga stepped inside as if crossing into another life, one ruled not by orders, but by the hum of ovens and the steady rhythm of hands at work. The air smelled of butter, cinnamon, and something else she could not name, perhaps peace. She no longer feared the Americans. The women from town greeted her by name now, offering warm smiles and bits of gossip about their husbands, their children, the latest ration shortages. Helga listened, nodding, storing every word like a souvenir from a world she might never know again. One day, as the sunlight streamed through the high windows, Mary arrived with a small basket of apples and a twinkle in her eye. "Today," she announced, "we make something special. You'll show me your strudel, and I'll show you my pie." The others laughed and gathered around, curious. Helga hesitated at first, shy under their attention, but Mary nudged her gently forward. She began by spreading the dough across the table until it was thin enough to see the wood beneath. Her fingers moved with a memory older than the war, stretching, folding, dusting the edges with care. Mary watched closely, then began her own process, rolling crust, sprinkling sugar, crimping edges with the same confident ease Helga had once admired. Soon the kitchen was filled with overlapping voices, the sound of women trading secrets. "You use vinegar?" Helga asked, surprised, pointing to Mary's pie dough. "Just a splash," Mary said. "Keeps it tender," Helga smiled. "In Germany, we say cold hands make warm bread." Mary laughed. "Then we'd both make fine bakers." When the pastries baked side by side in the oven, the mingled scent of apple and spice filled the air like a hymn. The women leaned on the counters, fanning their flushed faces, waiting for the timer to chime. In that waiting, something sacred lived, the quiet understanding that enemies could share a table, could feed one another, could choose creation over destruction. When the timer finally rang, Helga pulled out the strudel and Mary the pie. They placed both on the table, golden and glistening. The others gathered, taking cautious bites, then soft murmurs of delight spread through the room. "This," one American whispered, "tastes like home." Helga's eyes filled before she could stop them. "It does," she said quietly, even far away. Later, as they packed the pastries for delivery to the soldiers, Mary tore a scrap of paper and wrote down her recipe in neat cursive. She handed it to Helga. "A trade," she said. Helga unfolded her mother's faded recipe and placed it beside it. Two worlds, bound by flour and kindness. As dusk fell, Helga looked around the kitchen, the scent of apples still warm in her hair, and thought that maybe, just maybe, she had found a piece of herself again. That night, when the church kitchen had fallen silent and the guards were walking them back to the camp, Helga slipped her hand into the pocket of her apron. Her fingers brushed against the folded paper Mary had given her the pie recipe written in careful English cursive. The ink was smudged where her thumb had touched it too often, as though she could press the memory of that day into permanence. Back in the barracks, under the dim flicker of the lantern, she unfolded the paper again. The words looked foreign and beautiful, like a letter from another life. She took out her own scrap of paper, the one her mother had given her before the war, the edges browned and brittle from years of hiding. On one side, the recipe for apfelstrudel. On the other, a few faint lines of her mother's handwriting. "When you feel lost, bake. The smell will bring you home." Helga traced the words with trembling fingers. It had been years since she had dared to read them. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a long time she sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of wind against the tin roof. Then, in the dim light, she began to write. Her English was halting, her sentences broken, but the words came from somewhere deep within her. "Dear Mama, today I baked again. With Americans, they smiled at me. They let me touch the dough, and not as a prisoner, but as a person. For a few hours, I forgot the war. I remembered you. I remembered who I was before the noise." She stopped, staring at the unfinished letter. She knew it would never reach Germany. The camp censors would read every line, and even if they didn't, the sea between them was too wide, the ruins too deep. Still, she kept writing. "I think you would have liked them, Mama. They laugh easily. They bake differently, freely. I wish I could tell you that the world still knows how to be kind. Maybe it does." When she finished, She folded the letter carefully and slipped it inside her small tin box beneath the cot. It was not meant to be sent. It was meant to be remembered. Outside, the prairie wind howled, rattling the loose boards of the barracks. But inside the small room, warmth lingered soft and invisible, like the smell of baked apples that still clung to her hair. Before sleep took her, Helga whispered a prayer she had not spoken in years. It was not for victory or for homecoming. It was for peace, not the kind that nations declared, but the kind that could rise quietly in a kitchen among strangers who once called each other enemies. And for the first time since her capture, she drifted to sleep with a smile, the ghost of cinnamon still sweet on her lips. By the time the church's baking days became a routine, whispers had begun to spread through the camp like smoke through dry grass. Some said the Americans were trying to soften them, to make them forget their duty to the fatherland. Others accused the women who baked of being traitors in aprons, exchanging pride for comfort. Helga heard the murmurs while standing in the food line, her tray heavy with beans and cornbread. A few women turned their faces away when she passed. One spat the word Mitläufer under her breath, a follower, someone who bends too easily. Helga kept her eyes forward, but inside her chest, something cracked. That night, she sat on her bunk, the camp lights flickering against the tin walls. Elsa, her closest friend in the barracks, leaned toward her. "They're jealous," she whispered. "You found something they haven't." Helga shook her head. "I found nothing, only a few hours of peace." But Elsa smiled sadly. Sometimes peace is the bravest thing to find. The next morning, as the women marched toward their work details, Helga noticed two guards talking quietly near the gate. One of them, the younger one who always tipped his hat, caught her eye and gave a small nod, as if to reassure her that what she was doing was right. She wondered if he had heard the rumors too. In the kitchen that day, Mary greeted her with a warmth that seemed to erase the noise of the camp. "The boys at the base loved the strudel," she said cheerfully. "They said it reminded them of home." Helga smiled faintly. "Perhaps that is dangerous," she murmured. Mary looked puzzled. "Dangerous?" Helga hesitated, then said softly, "To make enemies remember they are human." Mary's face softened. "Then maybe it's the only thing that will save us." The words lingered long after they returned to work. The ovens glowed, and the scent of baking filled the air again, rising above the hum of voices like a hymn. Outside, soldiers walked past the windows, their boots echoing against the pavement. For a brief moment, Helga imagined the scent of bread drifting beyond the wire, crossing into places where hate still ruled, where bombs still fell. That night, when the women returned to camp, a sergeant stopped them at the gate. "You'll keep working with the church," he said curtly. "Orders from higher up." The others exchanged uneasy glances. The guard's approval only deepened the divide among them. Some thought it was a trap. Others feared it meant they were being watched more closely. But Helga felt something different: relief. Whatever it meant, the ovens would keep burning, and that was enough. As she lay awake later, listening to the faint echo of laughter drifting from the American barracks, she realized that kindness had become its own rebellion. While others fought for pride, she had found something quieter and stronger, the courage to be gentle in a world that demanded hardness. Snow began to fall across the Kansas plains as December settled over the camp. The fields that once shimmered with wheat now lay silent under a blanket of white, and even the guards walked slower, their boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Inside the church kitchen, the air was thick with the smell of spices and warmth. The Americans had decided to hold a Christmas feast, not just for themselves, but for the prisoners as well. When Mary told Helga the plan, she could hardly believe it. "For us?" she asked quietly. Mary nodded. "For everyone," she said. "War or not, it's Christmas." Preparations began days in advance. The churchwomen brought in boxes of ingredients: flour, dried fruit, molasses, even real sugar, a treasure in those ration times. The German women were invited to bake their own recipes alongside the Americans. Helga felt her heart swell when she saw the bowl of raisins and almonds laid out for Stollen. It was a small mercy, but one that carried the weight of grace. Together they worked, elbow to elbow, stirring, kneading, and shaping loaves, while carols played softly from a crackling radio. The melody of Silent Night filled the room, and though the words were sung in English, Helga mouthed them in German under her breath, the familiar tune threading across language and loyalty. When the first stollen came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, even the guard stepped inside, drawn by the smell. Mary sliced one loaf open, steam curling into the air, and passed pieces around. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a child, the pastor's daughter, tugged at Helga's apron and said shyly, "My mama says this tastes like heaven." Helga knelt down, her eyes stinging. "Maybe it does," she whispered. Later, long tables were set in the church hall, covered in mismatched linens and candles melted into mason jars. Prisoners and townsfolk sat together, the barbed wire still standing outside but forgotten for an evening. The guards served plates of turkey and potatoes, and the German women carried their loaves with pride. Laughter echoed off the walls, hesitant at first, then genuine. Someone passed Helga a small paper cup of coffee, and she lifted it in silent gratitude. Across the table, Mary met her gaze and smiled. "Merry Christmas, Helga," she said. "Merry Christmas," Helga replied softly, the words catching in her throat. That night, back in the barracks, the women shared what little remained of the stolen. It was sweet, dense, and rich with memory. As Helga tasted it, she felt tears rise not from sorrow, but from something deeper, something she had not felt since before the war. Hope. In the quiet that followed, she looked around at the others and realized that kindness could bloom even in captivity, and that perhaps the greatest victory of all was learning to be human again. Spring came slowly to Kansas, as if the land itself was learning how to breathe again. The snow melted into the soil, the prairie turned green, and word began to spread through the camp like wind through grass. The war was ending. Some women cheered quietly, others wept, and a few sat in stunned silence, unable to imagine what peace might even look like. Helga stood by the fence that evening, watching the sun sink behind the horizon, its last light burning gold over the fields she had once harvested. Beyond the wire, the American flag fluttered gently in the breeze. It no longer looked like a symbol of her enemy, but of something steadier, something she could almost respect. The guards' voices had softened, their orders less sharp. Radios played in the distance, filled with the news from Europe. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Reich was finished. The words hung heavy in the air. For so long, Helga's identity had been shaped by what she had been told to serve. Now that it was gone, she felt strangely hollow, like a house left standing after a storm but emptied of everything familiar. That night, Mary visited the camp one last time, carrying a basket of bread wrapped in linen. "They're saying you'll be sent home soon," she said quietly, her eyes glistening. "Home," Helga repeated, the word uncertain on her tongue. "If there is anything left." Mary reached out, pressing a small loaf into her hands. "Then you'll rebuild it," she said gently. "One loaf at a time." Helga smiled faintly, her throat tight. "You've taught me more than you know," she whispered. "No," Mary replied, shaking her head. "You taught yourself. We only lent you a kitchen." When Mary left, the camp felt emptier than before. Over the next days, soldiers packed supplies, fences were mended, records signed. The air buzzed with restless anticipation, but beneath it was sorrow too. The women had come to see this place not only as confinement, but as a strange kind of shelter, a world that had allowed them to remember who they were before uniforms and orders had stripped them bare. On the final night, Helga baked quietly in the barracks kitchen, with what ingredients she could find: flour, sugar, a bit of dried fruit. The others watched as she worked, her hands steady, her expression calm. When the bread emerged from the small camp oven, the smell filled the air with a warmth that seemed to bless the walls themselves. She tore pieces and shared them with the women around her, and for a fleeting moment, the barracks glowed with laughter. Outside, the prairie wind howled like a hymn. Helga knew the war had changed her forever, but as she tasted that last loaf, she understood something simple and unshakable: survival was not enough. To truly live again, she would have to remember how to create. The final days at Camp Concordia felt suspended between worlds, neither captivity nor freedom, but something fragile in between. The women no longer rose to shouted orders. The guards no longer carried rifles with the same tension. Even the prairie seemed to move slower, the wind quieter, as if it too were holding its breath for what came next. Helga spent her last morning in the church kitchen, where the light streamed in through the windows, dust floating like tiny stars in the air. Mary had come early, already rolling out pie dough. "One last bake before you go," she said softly. Helga smiled, tying her apron for the last time. Around them, the room hummed with an unspoken ache. Every scrape of a spoon, every laugh, every clatter of pans felt weighted with farewell. The Americans had brought extra ingredients that day: flour, sugar, butter, even fresh apples. A gift, Mary said. But Helga knew it was more than that. It was a benediction. They worked quietly, shoulder to shoulder, without need for conversation. Helga shaped her mother's apple cake, pressing each slice of fruit into the batter with reverent care. Mary tended her pie beside her, sprinkling cinnamon as though casting blessings into the air. The mingled scent rose from the ovens, sweet and heavy, filling the small church until even the guards at the door closed their eyes and breathed it in. When the baking was done, they placed the cake and pie side by side on the table, the crusts gleaming golden under the sunlight. 2 worlds in one oven, Mary whispered. Helga nodded, her eyes wet, and no wire between them. They ate together in silence, sharing coffee and small pieces of what they had made. Every bite carried memory, the fear that had softened into trust, the suspicion that had turned into care. Helga thought of the women she would leave behind, of Elsa, of the laughter in the barracks, of nights when the wind had howled and the ovens had burned like small beacons of humanity. "You'll start again," Mary said quietly. "Wherever you go, you'll bake. That's how the world begins again." Helga looked down at her hands, still dusted with flour, and nodded. "Then it will begin with bread." When it was time to go, the guards loaded the women onto the trucks. The church faded from view, the steeple vanishing behind the wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon. Helga clutched the folded paper Mary had given her, both recipes written side by side, now worn soft from touch. She pressed it against her heart as the truck rumbled away. The road ahead was uncertain, but she felt no fear. She had walked through hunger, through hate, through silence, and found her strength not in defiance, but in creation. Somewhere behind her, the scent of cinnamon lingered in the air, a quiet reminder that even in war's shadow, kindness could rise, warm and unstoppable, like bread. Years later, when Helga Müller finally returned to Germany, the air smelled different, like dust and smoke, but also something tender, struggling to survive. Bremen was a skeleton of its former self. Streets she had once walked as a child were buried under stone and ash. Her family's bakery, the small shop with lace curtains and a brass bell that once rang for customers, was gone. Only the foundation remained. She stood before it in silence, the Kansas wind still whispering somewhere deep in her memory. From her small satchel, she pulled the folded recipe paper, edges frayed, the ink faint but legible. On one side was her mother's apfel strudel, on the other, Mary's apple pie, 2 halves of a story that had somehow become one. She pressed it to her lips before tucking it back into her coat. There were no ovens left in Bremen, no flour to buy, no sugar to sweeten the air. But the neighbors had begun to gather what they could. One man had bricks, another had wood, and an old widow offered a small bag of wheat. Together, they rebuilt the bakery, stone by stone, until the scent of fresh dough filled the air once again. Helga worked tirelessly, her hands steady, her mind calm. She taught the neighborhood children to bake, laughing softly when they spilled flour across the table. When they asked her why she smiled so often, she told them, "Because the world still remembers how to rise." People began coming from all over the city, drawn by the smell of bread that carried through the ruined streets. Soldiers, widows, children, they stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting patiently, their faces softened by the warmth of something human. Helga named the shop Freiheit Freedom. She hung the sign herself, carved by hand from a piece of Kansas pine. Mary had sent years later, with a simple note, "For your new beginning." Every morning, as the ovens roared to life, Helga thought of that church kitchen across the ocean. She could still see Mary's smile, hear the laughter, feel the gentle rhythm of shared work. The war had tried to make enemies of them, but the kitchen had made them kin. One day, while dusting powdered sugar over a tray of strudel, Helga paused and looked out the window. Children ran past with warm bread in their hands, their laughter echoing through the alley. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, the scent of apples and cinnamon wrapping around her like a prayer. She realized then that peace was not something nations signed or armies enforced. It was something people baked into each other's hearts, one act of grace at a time. And if you ever wonder how humanity survives its darkest hours, remember this: kindness does not vanish in war. It hides in the simplest places. Sometimes, all it takes to find it again is a loaf of bread, a stranger's smile, and the courage to believe that warmth can still rise from ashes. Subscribe for more untold stories of compassion, courage, and survival from the forgotten corners of history.